Welcome back, everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in pies. And I've got the great pleasure and honour of introducing to you Robin Johnson. And I must say, when I Googled him on the internet this morning, it came up as Robin Johnson Pie. And I must say that I've known Robin now for 5 years, and I do know him very much as an enabler of ideas, of knowledge, of processes, of interactions, of networks. I very much see him as one of the few Renaissance people left in our epoch, and he is not only an editor of the Journal of Housing, Care and Support, but he's also an academic and has written and co-authored various influential books. I don't know if you know this one, Complex Trauma and Its Effects. I know several colleagues who've been very touched and influenced by this work. And of course, the reason you've come here this morning is to hear about the pie concept, which Robin developed and co-founded with his friend and colleague Rex Hegg, a psychiatrist, a specialist in personality disorder and complex trauma. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Robin Johnson, who's given me the expressive instructions to say to you, if you do have a burning question, do feel free to ask. He wants the session to be very much an enabling session, an interactive session. And so he's very much open to you sharing questions as they come to mind. So without further ado, Robin Johnson.
Okay, we need to check that the microphones and sound are working. Is everybody comfortable with this? My wife is always telling me that I mutter and I must speak up. So can everybody hear me? Great, okay. And hello also to those people in Liverpool and where is it? Edinburgh and Glasgow and Galway. It was a little daunting to discover this thing is going to be televised and live streamed. But hello everybody out there. I'm also aware that there are various colleagues of mine in the States who, ironically, granted what I'm talking about transatlantic dialogues, aren't going to be able to watch this until tomorrow, because for pity's sake, it's 6 o'clock in the morning in the Eastern Seaboard. So hello, folks out there who will get this message tomorrow. It's a bit like with those news quiz jokes, isn't it? So yes, if anybody has not just burning questions, but should we say smouldering questions, things you've always wanted to ask and so on, I'd rather we actually get the questions in as we go along, rather than have a 3/4 of an hour of me talking, and I could talk for hours. So if you've got questions you want to ask, I'm conscious that what I really wanted to talk about was what I have called transatlantic dialogues and the possibilities opening up of having a more dialogue-like relationship between examples of effective, constructive, innovative practice. I do want to argue that although evidence and data is important, data is not the only form of evidence. And I think it's really, really important that people's lived experience, including the lived experience of service providers, is understood, respected and appreciated. I want to make an argument, as I'll do towards the end, for action learning as being just as important and something that we really need to value and validate as we learn. Data is all about what happened in the past. And with services changing, with situations changing the whole time, we've got to be learning in the day-to-day, learning from the client, learning in the context. So that's the underlying point that I want to come to. But I'm conscious that quite a few people here today won't be very familiar with the concept of a psychologically informed environment in the first place. And so talking it over with John, since I've got the stage entirely to myself for the whole of the hour, we thought we'd reverse the sequence slightly. I was going to start talking about some of the new models of support for people, particularly entrenched homelessness, such as Housing First, and then where psychologically informed environments and a couple of other things like trauma-informed care and so on fit in. But we thought it might be useful if I started out by just going into a little bit more about the concept of a psychologically informed environment, to move that up first, if you see what I mean. Can I just get a quick sense from you? If we say, who here is relatively new to the whole idea and really wants to find out what's this about, where's it come from, where's it going? Oh, great. That's already, I'd say, getting on for a half. Who's come across this, is already working in a way that you believe is relatively psychologically informed, you've got some idea about it all, and relatively small group, or certainly smaller. And then who's interested in this transatlantic dialogues stuff? Oh, a few. Good, okay. Then that's, if we say roughly a third, I'm going to try and spend the first 5 minutes or so talking not just about what we mean by a psychologically informed environment, but also what the origins, where the idea came from, where the thinking behind this came from. And John, I'm going to need you as timekeeper here. Can you give me 5 minutes on this, and then after that we'll move on to trying to unpick the actual term. I talk a lot in housing and homelessness services and events. It's not that often any longer that I get to talk in a health context, in a health conference. I was a psychiatric social worker for much of my career, and so in the last 10-15 years I've kind of lost the opportunity to talk about the mental health angles. Well, I mention them a lot, but I wanted to take a moment just to talk about the roots in early social psychiatry and the therapeutic community movement in the immediate post-war years. And I think this may be one of my few opportunities to talk a bit about that. When we talk about the roots of this work in healthcare and mental health care, and we're talking about psychologically informed environments, it's often assumed that we're talking about psychology as a clinical specialism, and particularly clinical psychology. In fact, as we'll see, when we're talking about psychologically informed, we're talking much more about emotional intelligence and informed active empathy. But in the immediate post-war period, there was a really radical shift in people's thinking about how we work in mental health care. It's got quite a long history to it, but in 1948, a particular consultant psychiatrist coined the term therapeutic community to describe a new way of running and organizing a hospital and psychiatric care. The idea was that rather than a mental hospital being a place where the patients sat and were perhaps at best safely contained, fed and watered, whilst waiting for the therapist to come along and do the therapy, instead we should treat the whole hospital and the whole hospital experience as an opportunity for growth, for personal development, for challenge, for therapy. The whole hospital should run as a community in which all social relations between individuals, including cooks and cleaners and catering staff and nursing and others, were all equally involved in trying to help individuals learn the lessons that they might need to learn in their lives. That idea was really a breath of fresh air in psychiatric care in the mid-20th century. And with the development of phenothiazines, essentially, the drug treatments, that whole interactive, more psychotherapeutic approach became rather sidelined. But I worked in a particular therapeutic community unit that's very well known in that world called the Henderson Hospital. And I worked there in the early 1970s. I worked in a couple of other similar units throughout the 70s. And a lot of the lessons I learned about how institutions themselves may need to change and may need to learn to work differently if they're really going to address as creatively and constructively as possible the needs of the individuals attending there. A lot of my thinking comes from that time and from that therapeutic community world, which, as I say, got rather sidelined through the 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was working as a psychiatric social worker. What really surprised me was when I was working in a local community mental health team based in Nottingham, and we found that there were some patients that we really, really struggled with. We're used to working with schizophrenia and depression and anxiety and other, well, there were these awkward people with sort of traumatized, chaotic lives, endlessly not engaging, not turning up, seeming to sabotage sometimes the treatment programs that we'd set up for them. We would now call those the people with a personality disorder in sort of medical diagnostic terms. I prefer the term complex trauma as a way of talking about what's actually happened in those individuals' lives and the sort of the endless turmoil that they kind of live in and sometimes will bring with them. But the thing that really surprised me and that set me off on this new direction that I've been pursuing the last 20 years was when those individuals would be precipitately discharged from the ward, as quite often did happen. It's all behavioural. We can't have this, they're upsetting other patients. And anyway, it's a personality disorder, it's untreatable, they shouldn't be here, this is not the right place for them. People would often be sent down to the local homelessness unit. And what I found with a few of my patients, that the homelessness services were actually sometimes better at being able to engage those individuals on their own terms, settle them in. I would sometimes come back from a day's leave and my patient had been discharged from the ward, and I would be phoned up by the support worker of the hostel where they'd been placed, who'd already sorted out their benefits, who'd already contacted the family and let everybody else know, and now as an afterthought they were contacting the social worker. I thought that was the social worker's job doing all that stuff, but actually in the homelessness services, we did have some very, very good homelessness services in Nottingham. I'm all right for 5 minutes.
We're getting there. Got
Right.
3 minutes.
Oh, not bad. I want to tell this as a personal story because I think we all are all individuals and you need to know where we are in our own lives and so on. It's not just about a research program, but this is about my own particular interests and what motivates me. What I discovered was that in some homelessness, in the best of homelessness services, there was something happening that actually looked to me remarkably like the kind of exciting, creative, innovative work that we were seeing in therapeutic communities in the late 40s, 50s and 60s so somehow or other these organizations were learning the same lessons, and lo and behold, yes, it was often the same population. It was the same clients with the sort of traumatized, messed up lives who standard mental health services were not really geared up to work with. And they were falling through the healthcare nets. And who were they being picked up by? Well, I'll tell you, it wasn't just homelessness, it was the police, it was the prison service, it was A&E departments, an awful lot of the time. But certainly quite a high proportion of people who were falling through the mental health service filters were ending up in homelessness services. And the best of homelessness services were getting really rather good at dealing with those individuals and those needs. It was something very, very different from the image of homelessness, and certainly the image of homelessness services that I had had up until then. And that's what set me off on this path of trying to find out what is actually happening in the homelessness world. What does constructive, innovative practice look like?
Let's bang on
Just
5 minutes.
Okay. That's lucky. So one way or another, fast forward 20, 30 years, one way or another, I end up working with Department of Health, communities and local government on a program to ensure that people with major mental health problems are housed. It was part of the sort of social inclusion policies of the Blair-Brown government. And what I was very well aware of was that a lot of the people with the really severe mental health problems weren't actually in mental health services. And a lot of them were actually being managed as best they could, sometimes very effectively, in homelessness services. So with a couple of others, we conceived the idea of starting to write a document. It was going to be a codicil, we thought originally, to another policy document. A document describing the creative and the innovative work that was being done and the real kinds of problems that homelessness services were actually dealing with. That paper was published in 2010. It's often known as the complex trauma paper because we actually argued that although a lot of the epidemiological studies suggested that these individuals could have a diagnosis of personality disorder in medical terms, we thought frankly it wasn't a very helpful use. It wasn't a very helpful term, and we preferred the term complex trauma. So it's called Non-Statutory Guidance on Meeting the Psychological and Emotional Needs of People Who Are Homeless. You can see that I've practiced that. And that is what it was about. It was identifying, recognizing the levels of psychological emotional need and guidance on how services could be working with that population. And in the course of doing so, we wanted to try and find a word to describe what good looked like. Not just what were the problems people were actually dealing with and maybe the sort of therapeutic or philosophical or values-based approaches that might help, but in practice, what were we seeing going on? And we came up with, well, I came up with the term psychologically informed environment, mainly because we didn't want to use the term therapeutic community. It was associated with the health service, it was associated with the past, and we wanted to find a new term. And psychologically, we could just as well have said sociologically or anthropologically or psychodynamically. It's not a particular form of psychology, it's really much more, as I say, about empathy. And this is what we were tending to find. So let's go now to some of the, there we are. I'll come back to that. So we started using the, sometimes people are sometimes called the person who discovered or who invented psychologically informed environments. And I would say that's like saying that Columbus discovered America. There were people there before doing this. All I ever claimed to be is the person who tried to put in words what I was seeing, what we were seeing, the team of us who were developing this. This is a matter of a number of observations. The methodology is frankly journalism. We were trying to describe what we saw and trying to almost to bottle it, if you see what I mean. But people did come and then say, how would we do this? Can you give us examples of what we should do? Either some organisations were saying, oh yes, at last we've got somebody who finally is describing the work we're doing. And others were saying, well, we know this is what we need to do. How can you help us get there? And so we came up with 4 or 5, 6 key themes that were kind of distilled out from the experience of this relatively small team of people who were sort of putting together this idea. And so this has now become the sort of 5 or 6 principles that underlie what we call a psychologically informed environment. I would want to stress that these are not tablets in stone. This is not, you must do this. These are all areas that we found the most exciting places, the most innovative, creative, committed, etc. This was the kind of stuff that they were doing, and we tried to just tease it out. So, most places worked with some kind of psychological model, by which we don't mean necessarily CBT or psychodynamic or even strengths modeled positive psychology and so on. What we meant was that people looked at what was happening in the unit, the people that they were dealing with, in terms of that person's life experience and how they might see you, how what's happened to them in the past might colour their responses and their reactions to you. That's not a clinical specialism. It's not an academic specialism. It's something that all human beings do. We all do it to greater or lesser degree, sometimes despite circumstances and what we're supposed to be doing. But the more people had some kind of human psychology thinking driving the work they were doing, the more that tended to open up other ways, other opportunities to look differently about how the service itself operated. And then there were two or three examples of how, in practice, things were two or three particular areas that we thought lots of services focused on. One was a lot of care and attention to the way the built environment was used. Not just the furnishings, but also the lighting, the posters on the wall. If you have posters on the wall that say, "We do not accept any kind of violence here," what's that saying about what you actually expect? What's that saying about who you think these people are and what they've got to be prepared for if they come here? You know, think carefully about the messages. You might have an old sofa, which might be a tatty old sofa. Well, a tatty old sofa might actually feel quite safe to people who are used to living in a cardboard box, whereas a brand spanking new sofa has them on their best behaviour and so on. So using the built environment also doesn't necessarily mean expensive changes in the way the building operates. Just changing the colour of a light bulb from a sort of stark, clear blue light, it looks kind of clinical and administrative, to a sort of warmer orange or greener light, which looks more, you know, some of these things are very, very cheap. We're not talking about an expensive programme. I know other people who've talked about the built environment can also include the green environment, or in fact any kind of environment, which is where you relate to people. Lovely little blog written by somebody a couple of months or so ago about using her car as a psychologically informed environment. When she goes with a client to some particular, there's a different kind of relationship when you're just driving somebody around from when you're sitting in an office and talking to them. And she was noticing that and teasing out how that can be valuable as a stage in engaging somebody who maybe has difficulty engaging and trusting and so on. Another worker I was speaking to a few months or so was talking about going for a walk in the park, because that also changes the kind of, you know, you're a citizen when you're going for a walk in the park. I know a project up in Durham Way that works with sex workers, and they deliberately have some of their group sessions in the park, because if sex workers will often feel that they're not proper citizens with a right to be anywhere like everybody else does. So having their sessions in the park, they were using the built environment in a way that made that was paying attention to the messages that this was giving, and the environment itself was doing some of the work for them. It wasn't all necessarily talking about your problems. Sometimes it was about just finding a kind of new way to be. Particularly useful, therefore, for people in the contemplative stage, if you know that. So the built environment, the built and social environment, the green environment, and so on. A lot more I could say about that, so if people want to ask any further questions, we can look at them. Now, obviously, if what your staff are dealing with is complicated needs of people with complicated, often quite traumatized lives, the kind of staff training and the kind of staff support that you might want to put in place, if that's what your job is actually about, is going to be rather different from what your job is about if you're just clerking people in and out and directing them towards the welfare benefits office, which is 2 miles away on buses that don't run on Tuesday and so on. So a lot of the in places that we saw really did quite make a point of staff training and support. And note that when I say staff, I'm not necessarily talking only about paid staff, because volunteers, peer support workers and so on are to that extent part of the staff team, in my view. I've known places that have the cooks and cleaners getting staff. I've known places that have security guards at the door, and the security guards are also supervised they get the equivalent of clinical supervision. Well, who is most at the cutting edge of managing disturbed and disruptive behaviour if it's not? But at the heart of all this was a recognition that rather than just having a task or doing something for people, what services are doing is engaging individuals and creating and developing a relationship, perhaps long before that person has any real faith in their ability to change or to engage with other services. We found most difficulty finding the right term for this, actually. We call it managing relationships, but it's not really about managing. It's about valuing or believing in or making that the heart of the task. I sometimes started to use this kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek military term, the rules of engagement, because it's about how understanding and empathy is built into the way your organisation works. For example, what rules do you have about what behaviour is completely unacceptable, and how do you respond if people do behave in a way that really is completely unacceptable? Those are the rules that the establishment has. It's not just a matter of the empathy and the skills and training of the individual. Organisations do have rules. Some have more, some have fewer, but everywhere has written or unwritten rules. And so the way that this kind of psychological model and the understanding of the staff and the focus on relationship building and so on, the way that's written into the day-to-day workings. You know, is the kitchen open, between, for people to have a cup of tea or coffee, or do they have to sort of mill around? Is there a sort of coffee machine and so on? All those things. There's not a right answer, but the organisations have thought about that and said, well, perhaps we should have a little sort of area over there where people can make tea and coffee for themselves. Not over there, because that's where the sharp knives are. If you've thought about that, then you're looking at using the built environment and you're building in the rules of engagement, how the day-to-day business runs. Another area that we looked at was what we call evidence-generating practice. That's a term that we stole from the health service through psychology. It's not necessarily about creating, data and proper research studies. It's much more about learning from what you're doing. Again, it's that action learning theme that I was talking about earlier on. It's a more complex concept, and I don't want to dwell too much on it now, but if people want to ask more about it, please do. But underlying the whole thing, it's like the fifth beetle, the sixth of the five, is what we called reflective practice. Encouraging staff, creating a culture in which people think about what happened. And, if there was an untoward incident, do you actually have a kind of debrief afterwards where you think, how might have we handled that differently? And does that then get reflected in the way the organisation runs and even the staff training issues that you come up with in future? Reflective practice is learning by doing. Learning by what went well as by what went badly. But it's that culture of thinking about what we're doing that then infuses the whole organisation, validates and builds on all of these and changes the culture so that you then get a learning organisation, some people will say. So we've always seen reflective practice as being the golden road to becoming a more psychologically attuned, the whole environment starting to work in a different way. Oh, I was just going to say, no one's got their hands up with awkward questions. Please give me an awkward question. Another one?
Being told to stand up now. When you talked about reflective practice, I was wondering if service users are actually involved in that reflection, because quite often service users will see a situation very differently, not necessarily wrongly.
Yeah.
And service users can often pick up on it and highlight certain issues to staff and help with that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. In the same way that I've said that service users as peers and peer mentors and visitors and meet and greet people and so on should be regarded as part of the training of the staff team. I would say as much reflective practice as you can involve people with, but I wouldn't want to be prescriptive. It will vary from situation to situation. It'll vary from client group to client group. It may vary according to how long that person's been involved with your service. If if on their second day in the hostel they're expected to go along to a group where people are talking about, that may be a little bit too much to expect. So I think that it has to be handled with, discretion and sensitivity. But yes, absolutely. What I would want to get away from is the sort of group therapy approach, that involves everybody having to articulate and so on. But yes.
I was just going to say, well, not necessarily in group therapy, but I suppose in a way, dependent on the incident that you're analysing or reflecting upon, sometimes if someone's extremely unwell or extremely distressed, it's no good talking to them about a restraint that's just happened 10 minutes ago. It's got to be the right time, it's got to be the right environment for the person, because some people will not sit in a room full of professionals who are involved in their care and tell them exactly what they think. Sometimes it's a conversation like you'd have with, your friends, your colleagues. Just have a cup of coffee and have that conversation.
And after all, with clients as individuals, your reflective practice might want to be in a one-to-one session. It might want to be a walk in the park afterwards. It might want to be just sitting outside whilst that person's cooling off after some incident. It might be getting one of your service users who are more familiar and more settled to go and sit with somebody whilst they're there's no one right answer that's right in every situation, but it's asking the right question. So absolutely. A couple more, lady over here, and then a gentleman here, I believe I know.
Hi. One of my thoughts was a question, and the other one is kind of a challenge about how to make it work. So a lot of services working with clients who don't speak English as a first language are using interpreters. Most interpreters are freelance, not employed by the organisation. And it's how do we provide training and supervision and support to them? And that's been an ongoing challenge in my experience in terms of confidentiality. And you realise that the reason that's been broken by interpreters is because they're simply not coping. Do you want to do that one and come back to the other thought, or?
John, share this. help me out here.
So could you repeat that very briefly? I didn't quite catch some of that.
How do we provide training and support to freelance interpreters?
Aha, yeah.
Within budget?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it depends on the locality where you're based, your organisation, if it's part of an NHS trust, if it's freestanding. For example, in one NHS trust I was working with maybe 7-8 years ago, all of the interpreters were trained in base and were psychologically informed. So that counselling, psychotherapy, they had a very basic knowledge and understanding. Also, they were briefed before the session and they were debriefed after the session. Because of the trauma that might get expressed. So I think unfortunately it probably comes down to the management of the service and the policies. But coming back to Robin's point as to who is included in the staff team, does it include service users, peer navigators? Does it also include interpreters? And that's something I think for the organisation to debate and decide on. Thank you. Very interesting questions.
Very. And you have a second question.
Yeah, it was just really a comment. It's the first time I've heard acknowledged. I spent many years working with victims of sexual violence, and many of them have been labelled as personality disorder and told to pop off on their way, as though suddenly their needs vanished. And it's great to hear it recognised as complex trauma, because that's what the team thought it was and felt it was, but we're not people with white coats and fancy training. So it was really great to hear that.
Oh, good. When you're trying to get health service money or research money, you have to some extent, speak health service language. And so long as we're using DSM or ICD-10 criteria, then okay, we'll use the language of illness and clear-cut diagnoses, sort of pigeonholes. You can say, oh, is it a histrionic or a antisocial or exactly which of the 13 different varieties of personality disorder. If you're speaking that language, but when you're talking with your colleagues, and certainly when you're talking with your clients, I think the language of complex trauma. Within services, notice we tend to talk about complex needs. So we're looking not even at the experience of the individual and what they've been through, but what the service response is going to be. I think all of these are quite positive developments, that we're diversifying the language for different different horses for different courses. Let me take one more question, and then I want to try and suggest we move on to some of the other questions.
To your left, Robin.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, all right, we got 3 more questions. Come on, let's have them.
Sorry.
How are we doing for time? Because I do want to move on
We've
to...
got another 25 minutes.
Could we do 5 minutes then of further questions and try and sort of turn around quickly? Because I do want to look at where some of these ideas fit with some of the other interesting new ideas that are around, trauma-informed care, housing first and so on. So that was 3 questions, wasn't it? 1, 2, 3. Peter.
I wanted to make a comment really rather than a question. Peter Cockesall, I'm a psychotherapist and been involved in PIEs for years.
And one of the co-authors of the second...
Indeed, one of the co-authors. The psychological model really, as opposed to a behavioural model, I think that was the important thing of psychological model, not necessarily the particular psychological model, but that it is not behavioural. Up until then, hostels were largely run on behaviouralist models, and that if somebody did something, they were sanctioned with various things 3 times and they were evicted and so on. So you had homelessness hostels putting people out on the streets. The psychological model was intended to think about why people do what they do, and to understand, as the lady said over there, people are coming from a different set of experiences and with a different set of emotions and a different way of thinking about what they're doing, and it's having a dialogue between those. Yes. So I think that was the psychological model. It's as opposed to a behavioralist model.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'd just like to say a couple more things on that. One, the managing relationships, the idea was that relationships are something to be thought about and used, not just accidental, but are central, because they can be used to create a therapeutic change.
Yes.
And your relationships can always be used to be therapeutic or to be anti-therapeutic, as they often are if we don't think about them. And just the final thing is that in the guidance we missed out client co-production. It was a terrible oversight. It's a big hole in the guidance, and
absolutely.
It is. I think it's crucial to psychologically informed environments, because a dialogue between people in a big power differential is very different to a dialogue between people who have some shared power. And so I think co-production is really missing from that guidance.
Absolutely. It was kind of in there, but we haven't brought it out anything like as much as we would do if we were writing that document now. And there various people have been saying we really need to do
I think there's a lady at the front there who's
there's
been
a gentleman at the back, and
then to ask a question.
Gentleman at the back.
Okay.
Thank you. My name's Justin Roxburgh. I run a homeless services in Somerset. Just to say that if this does work, this really does work, and we've kind of got a culture through our organisation now of running in a kind of pie way. I didn't realise it was actually a pie, and I've not sold it to my staff team as pie, because you have to embed the principles of it within the organisation. So you start, I happen to be a chief executive, but you have that relationship with your senior managers, who then have the same relationship with the support staff. But you don't call it supervisions. You go for a cup of coffee, you have one-to-ones, you work out what's working, what isn't working, and then that is then followed through to the support staff having the sessions with the clients. So it's right the way through the organisation, and it's very much a culture of mutual support and working together with a very, very low hierarchy within the structure of the organisation. And staff training and support is exactly the same. So we set up a college. It's a virtual college. There's no building or anything, but it's a college where we provide training and support for clients and for staff, and sometimes they're sitting alongside in the same sessions. And that seems to work incredibly well. So they're going through the experiences together.
Great,
I think if we could just take one last question and then move on, because we're going to run out of time otherwise.
Can I just say, that makes the point beautifully, that this is not something new. We didn't come in and say, stop what you're doing, start doing this. We were just trying to bottle, to find, not necessarily even the active ingredients, but maybe the key indicators. This is what people were doing before we came along and tried to put it into words. So great.
Hi, mine's a very quick response, actually. I'm Angela Burnett from Freedom from Torture, and it was a response to your question about interpreting. And just to say, this guidance for commissioners of mental health services, which Johannes Fassel and I wrote for Mind, And we specifically say it's a way of making sure it's there if commissioners make sure it's part of the contract for both trained interpreters and support for interpreters. And I think that's really important. But unless it's in the contract, it may not happen.
Okay, if we could move on.
Can I? This is the stuff I really want to talk about, so I'll try and rattle through it as fast as I can. And I'm going to be around for the rest of the time anyway. Not all conversations happen in groups this size, after all. So, oops, no. I want to quickly go back. These slides are sort of culled from an article that I'm in the midst of writing, so the sequence follows the sequence in the article. You will hear a lot at the moment about Housing First as another really exciting new idea. There have been a number of studies of... Now, the Housing First model came over from the States. It's been imported into England, it's been imported into areas of Europe as well, so this is genuinely a transatlantic dialogue. I am uneasy myself about some of the implications of the application of Housing First, because I don't really understand the complicated social, political and financial circumstances in which housing services and homelessness services in the United States operate. In fact, I suspect they even vary from state to state. And if you take out the rest of the iceberg, we're using that iceberg image a lot of, if you take out the rest of the context, I'm not sure what lessons we can learn by simply importing one lot of ideas to another area. So I am questioning where some of these ideas are. But there are, I think, some really valuable bits in this. Rapid rehousing, if you have somebody who's long-term entrenched and so on, moving them straight into housing. As Neil Hamlet from Scotland was saying yesterday, the best place to feel whole and at home in life is in a home, rather than a hostel or a transient unit. The support in all Housing First models is voluntaristic. That's to say, it is never an expectation or a requirement for the service user that they should participate, engage in treatment programs and so on. The contrast here is a set of treatment programs they used to have in the States that very much did demand compliance. Get with the program. Yep. So this is saying the complete opposite, that actually the most effective ways of engaging people are to give them support on their terms when they want it, and they can refuse support if they so choose. And so long as they don't break the terms of their tenancy agreement, if they can survive without support, well, good for them. So the support is voluntary for the service user, for the housed person, but the staff support is committed. And staff support is committed long-term, even permanently, depending on the length of the programme. So that's quite a crucial part, and I'm not sure how easy we get that in this country. A harm reduction versus an abstinence model. This again is a more specific example of how the support regime has to be voluntary. An abstinence model demands complete abstinence from drug and alcohol, yes? A harm reduction model just says we'll work with you to reduce your use, your level of use, your damage and so on. So that is a specific substance abuse example of the voluntaristic model. And the other aspect that's key to Housing First is a focus on the most severe. That's, I think, partly because they didn't simply want cherry picking of the easy people go into the services. But it also means that the people who most other services have failed are the ones who may need this most intensive and sort of committed support. On the face of this looks a bit like it's a rights-based discourse. This is all about people's rights to refuse or to accept or refuse treatment. But of course, underneath this, there's a great deal of psychology. There's all the positive psychology of working with people's ambitions. There's some of the... Everybody know the cycle of change? The idea that sometimes people have to go cycle through many, many times of attempting to get themselves together before they can make change. Interestingly, a lot of the people that work on a cycle of change model, things like Alcoholics Anonymous and even Weight Watchers, use a lot of group support and group reinforcement. Whereas if you're housing people straight into an individual tenancy, are you dispensing with, are you doing without that group support? Or can that be put in later in a sort of clubhouse or core and cluster kind of model, working with people in their own homes. In other words, where does Housing First fit with the psychologically informed environment stuff, which is really about how hostels can be really valuable recuperative places? I'm not sure how those two discourses fit together. And that's one of the reasons that I'm planning myself, in fact, to go on a trip to the States to actually just talk to people and find out. Because I think sometimes it's only by in-your-face dialogue that you really start to understand how things are working. The other thing that's very clear is that there's a very strong evidence base behind Housing First. It's been going for 10, 15 years or so. It is a particular model and a particular way of working which lends itself, therefore, to some kind of rigorous comparative studies, even quantitative studies. I do notice that in the Housing First pilot studies that were run in England, I think the report came out a couple of years or so ago, 80% of the people who were housed successfully, on the whole, through the Housing First programme had previously spent some time in a hostel. So one possibility is that rather than Housing First meaning, oh, we don't need hostels at all, it means that the hostel has a different role in a model which is much more towards supporting people, engaging them in their own homes. I don't know. This is what I'm interested in. This is what I'd like to find out more about. But I'm not sure how those two fit together. But I want to go on to another thing that's coming to us from the States.
There's 10 minutes left.
10. I'm going to have to really motor mouth my way through this. Trauma-informed care. Services explicitly set up with an awareness of trauma. You know, we've talked about complex trauma as being something that underlies the kind of understanding in a psychologically informed environment. In the States and in some other areas like Australia as well, people are talking about trauma-informed care, and so far as I can see, trauma-informed care and psychologically informed environments are like the difference between sidewalk and pavement. There are some differences. It's much more informed specifically by trauma, whereas the psychologically informed environments ideas are much more about action learning, learning from doing, learning from what works, that therapeutic community tradition before. But an emphasis on safety, opportunities to rebuild a sense of control in your own life for people who've been traumatized and have had no control over their lives. And very much a strength-based approach, so their psychological model is both coming from trauma and looking at the positive psychology involved. So there are other key features in trauma-informed care. I want to go and visit some trauma-informed care environments and find out more about how they work. I have recently had a contact from somebody from a women's refuge, in fact, in Los Angeles, who'd been on the transatlantic exchange. And she was saying that she was really, really enthusiastic about the psychologically informed environment idea. And it fitted very well with the trauma-informed care, as if they kind of needed each other, they sort of supported each other. So the relationship seems to be more synergy than simple duplication. But I think it's a very interesting new idea, and I think we'll want to hear more about this. We'll want to learn from trauma-informed care services. It looks to me, therefore, this kind of maybe a strip relationship between PIES and trauma-informed care, where each of the issues kind of comes out in a different way. Hold that image in your head, because I'm going to play around with that in the next few slides, if I get there. I do want to talk about a couple of books written by a chap I came across via one of those LinkedIn discussion groups. His name is Jay Levy, social worker, in fact, by profession, working in Boston and then Massachusetts area. And he's written books about what he calls pre-treatment. Oh yeah, these slides are wrong, by the way. This is some of the Housing First. I did this in a hurry. So don't trust that, don't believe that. There are a number of key principles in pre-treatment. Unfortunately, I've not got written up. But this is about the actual skills of engagement with individuals. This is about the ways that you go at the client's pace, the way you get where the client is at. And it's all, again, about promoting safety, forming a relationship. Jay is very interested in what he calls finding a shared language, a way for the service providers and the service users to start to talk about the issues in their life in a way that means that a dialogue and a discussion is possible. I'd love to spend half an hour or more talking about these books, because I think he's one of the people who, for me at least,
the name of the ISBN?
yep. Talk to me afterwards, or
Okay,
we'll
we've
we'll
also
get it
got
into-
one question from one of our other centres, and we've got about 10 minutes left, so Robin.
The other thing I want to talk about is a new initiative. The Big Lottery is funding a number of Fulfilling Lives programmes, working with complex needs in, I think, 12 different parts of the country. I know the service in Bristol very well, but up in Newcastle and Gateshead, they have a model there which I think is really, really interesting and potentially quite radical. What they're saying is that a lot of exclusion is systemic. It's not even to do necessarily with the behaviour or the past trauma or whatever of that individual. It's to do with the way the services themselves operate. So you have a group of, I think, about 100 or so people with the most entrenched and chronic complex needs. A small team of about 8 or 10 workers, care managers, service negotiators, brokers, and so on. But then, rather than just working with the individual to try and get them an improved service, the advocacy, care management kind of role,
We're down to 5, Robin. We're down to 5.
feeding that information up into an interdisciplinary interagency panel at local level to say, what do the services as a whole need to learn from this at commissioner level, at senior service manager level, recognising that a lot of exclusion is systemic. Again, it's an action learning model. It's about it's holistic, but at a services level rather than just at a face-to-face level. And it works with what I would call a social model of disability, that recognising that a lot of disability is the way that society is organised and keeps people in their pigeonholes.
I think we owe it to our other audience online to have them air their question, because we have 5 minutes left.
Go on then.
And I think the audience
Please do.
probably have questions. So please.
So this is from Graham Gill Emerson, watching in Cork. His question is it an international phenomena that the main substances of choice among homeless community are sedative in nature, alcohol, heroin, benzo, cannabis, as it is in Ireland? Is this a national trend or an international piece that reflects an inherent level of overwhelm in our often traumatised clients?
It's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer any more than anybody. My answer is worth no more than anyone else's. Anyone else want to hazard an answer to that?
I was just looking at the, the baclofen and how that's. I was just, we discussed yesterday about the baclofen model and that it's worked, and we don't use it where I come from, but it works with the anxiety that the person is left with at the end of stopping their alcohol. So, we can get people in for detox, we can stop the alcohol, but why do they go back? And a lot of the time it's because of that generated anxiety, and usually the things that they drink in the alcohol for to forget usually come to the fore, and the trauma then is reintroduced in their life. So I think the baclofen is probably says to me that yes, the anxiety and the trauma is there, and that they're self-medicating, and I think that's something that, I don't know if everybody would agree with me that you think.
I'm afraid the simple answer I have to give is I simply don't know. I've got about 3 more slides I want to rattle through.
Gentleman at the back over there. Oh. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
I've used various drugs over a course of about 30 years, and I've never become addicted or had a problem with them. And I always questioned what that was that made me different to most of the other people. It is usually trauma, and they tend to want to block things out, and they don't want to have to deal with things on a daily basis. So that's why I would suggest that most people tend to use sedatives. That's why this spice that's coming out at the moment, it's a very quick fix to that. It blocks out everything. You don't remember what happened. You can have awful experiences, but you won't remember it, and it's just a way of passing time without dealing with the issue.
One last question for now, because I know Robin wants to finish something off very quickly. So last question for now.
I'd prefer to, but
Sorry, I was only adding briefly to what my friend was saying. I have borderline personality disorder, and so I have also suffered from substance misuse issues in the past. And to answer that question, it's exactly that. my personality disorder means that I have no emotional stability, and I find everything overwhelming. Taking substances like heroin just means that I don't have to deal with it. It was a blocker. So yeah, the answer was, but it's individuals, it's different for everybody. So that's the thing, nobody's ever going to be the same.
Thank you for sharing that. Robin, did you want to?
I just want to quickly try and sum this up. I'm going to have to really rush this. I showed you a Mebius strip model before, where psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed care seem to me to sort of be just different sides of the same coin. It seems to me that housing first, pre-treatment, system change brokerage, we're all, in a way, using the same themes of empowerment, holistic at one level or another, very much around voluntaristic rather than coercive models of care, all using a psychological model of one kind, all trying to individualize, but at the same time have some kind of coherence in the system and the staff training needs and so on. So this sort of Celtic cross image, I thought, was a nice counterbalance to the Mebius strip. I think it is, what I suggest is happening in a whole wide variety of different settings. We're getting convergent evolution. This is the human eye, and this is the octopus eye. Octopuses are, they're invertebrates. And yet we're all starting to develop the same kind of approach, the same kind of way of seeing, the same kind of... We've come from different places, different countries, different language, different clinical or sociological or housing management kind of perspectives. But it seems to me that we're all starting to talk to each other and discover that, okay, you say sidewalk, we say pavement, you say bonnet, we say hood, or is it the other way around, and so on. But actually it's all the same journey. Let's skip over that. This is such a funny little slide. Agriculture, right? It used to be said that agriculture was developed in the Tigris, Euphrates, and then spread across the rest of the world. We often think that ideas transmission is like that. It's now believed that different forms of agriculture were developed in at least about 20 or so different parts of the world. I think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is that we're using this new way of understanding, and that all these services are independently discovering new and exciting and personalised and contextualised. But there's a great joke that goes with this. This whole idea of independent is known as 50 Shades of Grain. I just couldn't resist that. How are we doing for time? We can lose that. Nice example of some of the new technology that we can use for live streaming conversations between people. We're going to be starting to use this to have conversations with people in Scotland, with people in Ireland, and so on. You can sit there in your own desk, in your own living room, in your dressing gown, and have conversations with somebody who's doing something a bit similar to you in another part of the world. Very, very exciting, so long as you don't sit with your back to the light. So a lot of things to learn, and just lastly, this is me. This is me talking about the trip to America, which I'm planning in a couple of weeks' time. That's about it, isn't it? Not much time for more else.
Thanks very much for that, Robin.
Bit of a gallop, the last bit.
Yes. One thing I remember certainly is that a car, even a car, can be a pie. that is caught me by surprise.
It's how you use the environment you've got.
Exactly. Anybody want to make final comments or final questions?
Just about the housing first. When the government gave money away a couple of years ago, a couple of million to various projects, and I was fortunate enough to be involved with a really small project on the Wirral Housing First with some of our really entrenched homeless people. They went straight into accommodation, generally shared with two people, but very homely, like their own home, with support workers, with peer mentors. And I was only talking to the manager of the person that was the lead in that at that particular time, and saying about the Housing First and how it failed And I sort of said to it, it really didn't fail. What happened was that there were some people who, what we did is we identified that that environment wasn't the right environment for them. And some of those people moved into supported accommodation. And some of those people had sort of not complex traumas, but their physical health. And alcohol-related brain injury was one of the things that was the biggest issue, that our entrenched guys who are out there on the street who are malnourished, are drinking really heavily and aren't taking thiamine and really sort of physically quite damaged, that when we did take them and put them in the environment and start to try to manage that, we were picking up how people were quite damaged cognitively. You know, so I sort of stressed to her that how those people who she felt she failed are actually living now in accommodation with support and are actually well, and there was issues with capacity and some people having to have a deprivation of liberty, but it actually highlighted that, because before then they were on the streets and they were living on the streets and they were quite severely mentally ill, and we just were not picking them up because they did not fit into the hostel model and were always excluded because of behaviours which, as we found, were due to the severe mental illness and cognitive impairments. So it doesn't always work, but it doesn't work for a reason, and generally it's because of ill health.
I think there's unlikely to be one answer that works for every situation, for all cohorts as well. We now need to start thinking in terms of cohorts. We need to have an ecology of services rather than kind of one first past the post winner in the evidence-based scramble.
Oh, just behind you.
And then over here.
Really, I just wanted to highlight the importance as well, because it hasn't really been mentioned yet about young people. You know, because actually, you know, the therapeutic community model is used with young people, or at least I've been in a unit where it was used. To be honest, for me, it was useless. It wasn't managed properly. It ended up, the peer relationships ended up quite detrimental and became quite challenging. But also some of the staff attitudes were quite negative. You know, I was told by one of them I was too old to self-harm and that it wasn't age-appropriate behaviour because I was going to be an adult soon. Which I find absolutely ridiculous, you know, from a qualified nurse to say that. But also I found it interesting earlier when you were talking about, you know, training the cook and training the security guard, because actually some of the people that I got on best with in hospital, in various units, were actually the people that make the food, you know. It's like, you know, because they're around more, the cleaners, the people that are actually on the ward.
Have more contact with the patients than the psychiatrist.
It's not always the most qualified that make the difference. You know, I owe my life to a nurse and assistant, to be honest. So.
I should say, I'm not particularly saying the therapeutic community is the right thing and is the answer to everything. I've moved on 30 years since working in therapeutic community. I think some of those ideas applied in a different setting come out in a completely different way, but it's still dependent on having good staff and good training and good staff support. Without that.
Claire Fleming, GP from Bristol. You just said about how it's not what you have, but how you use what you have. And I'd like to sort of add a rider to that. It's not what you see, it's how you see. And it's not what you hear, it's how you hear. And you've talked about therapeutic communities. But actually, I think there's something to take on from that as well, which is being therapeutic individuals. Are we living a psychologically informed internal environment?
Nice.
Because actually that's going to change how we see and how we interpret. It's going to change our core belief systems. It's going to change the structures of our lives. And it's changed people that change systems ultimately.
Okay, one final question before we break up.
Hello. Adrian Bonner, University of Stirling. Deeply impressed by your wide-ranging conversation this morning and recognise the importance of PI approaches with individuals, but there's also an organisational aspect to this.
Absolutely.
I know of particular ways by which, or examples, for instance, in which a nutritional strategy has been introduced to an organisation, or a well-being strategy is introduced, and it's actually collapsed after a year or so, mainly because it wasn't actually taken on board by the staff. So that at an organisational project management, program management level, I think there's a lot to be said for using a pie approach for changing the program or advancing the program of a particular organisation.
One of my worries is that the idea of a pie, which started out as a description, intending to encourage and, I suppose, inspire even, can turn into a prescription and something that everyone is expected to do because central office have said. And I think that is the exact opposite of how this needs to go. It's got to be bottom up. About that.
A quick comment, there's been a very interesting strand about the sociology, if you like, of homelessness, and perhaps what we also need is a pie society as well as pie services.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for Robin's welcome and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.